But this is the portion that I wasn't sure if I would get to within the 13, 14 weeks. But the new content, new section here is associated with conflict. And we sometimes associate conflict with the word argument. And argument is sometimes subjective. But we will be looking at the broader meaning of conflict. The authors do a great job in chapter 12 giving illustrations and also explanations that to leave anything out would be a disservice to the work they put into the chapter. It's what I consider to be, with full focus and thought, a masterclass. It is, word for word, very well explained from the years of their expertise. And so I took that in consideration when deciding to teach this way, which I've only done one other time in this whole series. Also, the reader will be able, that is you as the listener, if I do the speak reading work for the second half of the class, will be able to, hopefully with well-spoken narrating, understand the scenario being described, and you can ask yourself, does that apply to me, and if so, how? That's always fun. So rather than skipping, summarizing, and abbreviating, I will be speaking, focusing, and elaborating just a little as we go, maybe some personal stories along the way. But I will also be looking at the full content over the course of 2 classes. The majority of chapter 12 we'll deal with next week because I've got some things by introductory that will be fun and exciting for you and also related. But first, here we go. We wanted to look at the contents and see where we've been. The first part, we talked about boundaries. The whole book in the series itself is summarized in these 3 chapters, and a boundary is really just a principled standard of how you expect to be treated, and or for yourself, the standard you hold yourself to, righteously drawn from where you are in your growth so that you can continue to grow. It's for mutual growth, ultimately for your own benefit in the marriage. So it's standards. Personal boundaries are property lines so that as you grow together as a couple, you help each other do the same individually. A blessed marriage is built on 6 values, and it is important to put God first because that lines up everything else in accordance to His ultimate truth. If you do that, then you will prioritize your spouse. You will be honest, or in this case, with the mate, transparent, and that means vulnerable about strengths and weaknesses. It means you will be loyal, that is committed. The idea of mercy means you are compassionate enough to extend the grace to your spouse that both have received, because no one is perfect and each of you will let the other down. But the goal is you are pursuing holiness, and that is the solid ground if both in Christ. That being stated, these will sustain you. These values will sustain you through conflict or strife or circumstances that preferences don't always align. How do you get through those times? These lessons following in this chapter, and these chapters on the screen, will certainly help with that. And now for some memes that relate. You've seen this one before. It has a little bit more screen time because it helps set the tone for some others. The differences are what you like about a person at the beginning and then fight about the rest of your lives. Well, you know, it's interesting. Just last night I listened to a whole session from John Gray back in the day of 1994. And he was emphasizing throughout all of that 7 stages, and he emphasized this key point, that you are attracted to what you're not. And that's good that you are with someone who is not like you in that sense. Otherwise, there wouldn't be the need for the variety or the other. But if you're not careful, then if the differences are not mutually appreciated and valued, then what can be is that what you are alike can be then a temptation in the form of an outside attraction. So it's very important to have individual appreciation and the identity of the marriage mutually growing to prevent, of course, some of the problems as well as to develop the intimacy within. After saying that, we have something else. Couples who argue a lot love each other stronger. No, they don't. I just love stuff like that. Well, if arguing is love, then it's in some people's homes, and Sometimes that word argue is misplaced based on, or I should say tagged onto emotions based on how people react to anything brought up in common discussion. That, I hope that I'm not speaking in riddles. If you're with me, you're with me. So sometimes an argument may not be an argument, and this kind of illustrates it better. When you're in an argument with your wife or husband in this case, but we know the stereotypes that typically are joked about, and she realizes that you are winning the logical, analytical dialogue, okay, and the mind, of course, of the male might be missing the whole point, you know. Well, I guess I'm just a bad wife, aren't I? I'm going to bed. What's with you? Why are you yelling? You don't have to be mean. I guess I just don't do anything right. Those are emotional cue words to let you know something's not being conveyed, received, or communicated, either giving or receiving. Different AM, FM frequencies, right? Well, keep that in your mind a little bit here. Sometimes husbands try to listen, but they just need to be guided a little differently. Husbands are the best people to share a secret with because they'll never tell. They're never even listening. Well, there's a case in which the mind of the male may not be fully there. So that's why in a sermon recently about communication, I said it's good to turn to and stare at the mate because it helps me maybe more than it might help you. But it's a good way to communicate. I'm striving to listen to every word, and that does help. But communication is key. Here's what women sometimes say. And of course, stereotypes, it goes both ways, either way. Communication is key. Well, okay, men would say, what's wrong? Tell me. And then the response is, nothing, good night. So if something's not being communicated, and if that is the case, I think it would be good to see reason and caution for why things are not shared. And we've brought out many things to help us see why sometimes there are roadblocks to communication, and those might need to be dealt with. Serious conversations are not easy. But as we move on, as we also think about the importance of communication, I worded it this way. Poor communication in the home can become a weakness to enjoy good communication out of the home. So as you can see from what's displayed, it's very important to make sure there is good communication between the spouses. And here's another one. Whatever a spouse struggles with, the whole family is affected. This is simply an impressionistic art. It's not even captioned. But it lets you know that whatever a spouse is going through, he or she may not even see the resources of help or appreciate them fully at the time. But it is good if the spouse and family are there for the spouse at the time. So whatever is being truly struggling or plaguing an individual, it's important to make sure that we acknowledge it as much as possible so that we can have that help in time of need. We have another one here as we think about children. Just a side note for future. There are two gifts that we should give to our children. One is roots and the other is wings. There's so much proverbial wisdom in that, right? It takes time for roots to grow deep. And it will be emphasized that raising children takes a lot of time. But in this class, in this chapter, it takes a lot of time to keep the marriage strong. Statistically, I've shared before that after the children leave home, that's a very dangerous time for some marriages if they have not invested properly to keep that strong. And it's a strong truth. It's a bold, hard to hear truth. But parenting, even though you're always a parent and always give advice, that's not the point. When the authors say parenting is temporary, ideally, of course, in that sense, we understand the idea it's temporary when they grow into adulthood. But marriage is permanent, or to be long-lasting, lifelong. So that's why it's important to make sure to invest the time in marriage. Here's an interesting meme I saved a long time ago, and it fits perfectly for this class. Most people get married believing a myth or an idea, maybe an immature idea, that marriage is a beautiful box full of all things that they have longed for. Okay. He plays some word games here, but it's a box full of companionship, intimacy, friendship, etc. The truth is, and when I hear that, I mean, okay, I think this is a perspective that needs to be included and discerned based on what he's contrasting. The truth is that marriage is, at the start, an empty box. Now, even though it's by God's design, this is your experience from the beginning. So you must put something in before you take anything out. There is no love in marriage. Love is in people. And of course, love is of God. People put love in marriage. There is no romance in marriage. You have to infuse it into your marriage. A couple must learn then the art and form the habit of giving, loving, serving, praising, keeping the box full. If you take out more than you put in, the box will be empty. And of course, marriage is two, so it needs to be reciprocal and cooperative. That goes without saying, but I said it anyway. Here's another one. Good relationships don't just happen. They take time, patience, and two people who truly want to be together. Well, sometimes the loving feelings aren't there, but it is a determination. It is a resolve. It is a what? Commitment or covenant. Very important to say it that way. So with that being stated, let's go through some of these nicer ones. A most romantic love story isn't Romeo and Juliet who died together, but Grandpa and Grandma who grew old together. Some of you have memories of your grandparents and cherish those if you have that blessing. I do as well with mine. Both sets of my grandparents are not here, but they had that example, and I appreciate that. So this is a familiar one in my collection. How did you manage to stay together for 65 years? And the quote is, we are from a time and generation where if something is broken, we fix it, not throw it away. I think that's powerful in its own way. It's very pithy, and we get the idea. This will come into play as you're thinking about maintaining love in the face of conflicts or disagreements, even perhaps some emotional, expressive conflict of opinion. Love is caring for each other even when you're angry. And you see that elderly man who is still protecting his wife even after some kind of a spat. And I think that's a beautiful thing. Here's one I got recently from one of my friends' posts. Anger prevents you from seeing clearly. Ego prevents you from learning from others. Envy prevents you from focusing on yourself. Because you look to others and you don't realize what you have or don't have. So it's interesting. The misadjustment of either one, ego or envy. Ignorance prevents you from making good decisions or your own areas of growth. Fear prevents you from seizing opportunities. Some people don't attend this class because they see the title and they're fearful, frankly, of what might be brought up. That's just a fact, so we are aware of that. So the caption at the bottom is, get rid of them all. So how would that come into play? Well, that means be calm. Be calm in place of anger. Be loving, be humble. Humble enough to acknowledge faults and be informed of how to improve. Be open to that. And of course, also be brave. So that's encouraging. And sometimes your spouse can bring this out. This list is only shown because of the third and fourth one from the bottom. A quality of a good man. I'm thinking, oh boy, this is usually a list of preferences, but this one brings out a wording I want to draw your attention to. He doesn't, a real man doesn't allow his friends to influence him. And we get the idea by connotation, negative influences. The authors say a lot about making sure you have people around you who are encouraging of the marriage. And I'll say good friends give good advice. But the next one says, also has no problem admitting when he's wrong. And that's a developmental process. No one likes being wrong, but it is good to have the spirit develop that we can make a commitment or a discernment, conviction based on what we know, and always open to learn broader perspectives that help us be more refined. If that's the case, you're more humble for receiving. If, of course, from the one that you're married to and love the most, correction is given. And sometimes this is the case. An apology is the best way to have the last word. And that is so true. I'm going to share with you a meme. I'm going to describe it to you. I didn't have time to put it on the screen, but my nephew sent me one of a fake screenshot of a conversation between a son and a father. The son says to the father, Dad, I want to marry. I want to get married. The father says, say sorry. For what? Say sorry. But for what? You first say sorry. But what's my fault? You first say sorry. Well, at least tell me the reason. First say sorry. Okay, Dad, sorry. Now you're ready for marriage, son. Your training is complete. Isn't that great? Well, the conversations take place that way. And sometimes we don't know what we did. We don't have it yet. Sometimes I've said sorry. And then weeks later, I get it. I said, oh, yeah. From her perspective. Yeah. But anyway, it takes time sometimes. And yet, this is a humorous conclusion to the memes here. Maturing in marriage is learning that even eating nice food without your wife is also cheating. That one's kind of funny to me because sometimes I'll have a few dollars in my wallet and I'll think, Terry does the meticulous booking, okay, or bookkeeping, and I think, these dollars are off the grid. I can go through Arby's and get a roast beef sandwich with potato cakes and she'll never know. And then, of course, I'll tell her, guess what I had that I'm not going to tell you, So that's kind of funny. Anyway, hope you enjoyed those relatable points. The authors don't have a video for chapter 12. They just don't. But this video is a good preview for what's ahead, and it's a tone setter for what we're about to read. It's just about 4 minutes long, and I hope you enjoy. Then I'll get back up here and speed through when I say speed through, I won't slow this pace, but I'll maintain proper reading pace for just a few pages here in chapter 12. And wherever we get to for class time, we'll pick up there where we left off. And again, I'll tell you, for conflicts, we're only getting started, and this is like a whole little mini class within itself. It's a bonus class series. And the authors get you set for all kinds of conflicts. Let's see. Thank you again, Phoebe, for the audio adjustments. Let's see.
I had a difficult session. Referring to her husband, Robbie, she said, "He just doesn't understand how much I'm hurting. I've talked to him before about things, but it just doesn't do any good." She was very concerned about Robbie's drinking. She was upset about his workaholism, and she seemed really hopeless. And it sounded as if Robbie would be the kind of person who was unwilling to change anything for her. But since it was a relationship problem, I wanted to talk to him as well. At first, she seemed pretty reluctant to agree to my seeing Robbie, saying that she didn't think it would be very helpful or that he would be very open to her complaints. When I went into the waiting room, she was sitting there with him. I had kind of braced myself for his denial, so it was refreshing to hear him say, "I have a problem. Please help me."
In any situation requiring change, and marital conflicts do meet that criterion, two major issues appear right off the bat. First, the issue to be dealt with, and second, the ability of the person to deal with the issue. If number two is good, in most cases, number one won't be a problem. But people who are not open to feedback, who cannot see when they're wrong, who do not like limits of any kind, and who blame everyone else for their problems, well, we call them boundary resistors. People who have the ability to hear feedback and listen, we call boundary lovers. If you have an attitude of openness, a desire for your spouse and you to experience freedom and love, then you're going to be able to talk through these problems and really help each other.
Remember, conflict is normal. If you didn't have conflict, one of you would be unnecessary in the relationship. Yet, the fact that conflict is normal doesn't make it an easier thing to work through. The Bible, however, suggests the following predictable path for resolving all kinds of conflicts.
The first step is observation. You really can't fix a problem that you don't see. One of you has to notice the problem first and see it and perceive it as a problem or conflict.
Then comes confrontation. You can't fix a problem you don't talk about. Speak honestly with each other, but speak the truth in love as you let your spouse know what is wrong.
Healthy confrontation will move you to the third step, ownership, grief, and apology. If you are the problem, or at least part of it, own it. If you've been hurt, own your hurt and communicate it. If you're the one doing the hurting, confess and apologize. If you're the wounded party, forgive as well as express your hurt.
The next biblical step is no surprise, repentance. Once you see your part in something, repent. Change your mind to see how serious it truly is. And in short, stop it. Commit to change.
Step 5 calls for action, for involvement in the process. Problems don't go away immediately. So become involved in whatever process will be necessary for change. It may be counseling. It may be some other form of structured help. But commit to it, stay involved with it.
Finally, step 6 is re-examination. Have some system of re-examination. Just because you face something doesn't mean that it's gone forever. Get a checkup from those to whom you've made yourself accountable, and then continue to get re-examined for other things as well.
Now, if you have a boundary-loving spouse, and you're one yourself, you are indeed fortunate. It means you're both open to the truth and responsibility and freedom and love. And if both of you are open to such things, God's going to help you find them.
Remember, though, that conflict can still be painful even if everyone's open to feedback. Negative things hurt, and losing things hurts as well. So remember the basic rules of communication. Listen and seek to understand the other before you seek to be understood. Next, actively empathize and use reflective listening to let the other person know that you understand. Then, don't devalue or explain away what the other person is feeling or saying. Don't defend yourself, just listen. Then clarify to make sure that you understand. Ask questions. Use I statements that show you're taking responsibility for what you are feeling or wanting.
Now, a quick word to those of you whose spouses are more boundary resistant. In your participant's guide, you'll find a way to approach your mate with grace and with truth. Now, this path is more challenging than if you were dealing with a boundary-loving spouse, but the journey is certainly not impossible with God. Your boundary-resistant spouse can learn to honor your boundaries.
In closing, don't be afraid of conflict. There's always a death before a resurrection and a conflict before deeper intimacy. Go through it lovingly, and chances are you will find more intimacy with your mate on the other side.
Obviously, there's a lot that we are looking forward to reviewing in detail. But as practical as some of those pieces of advice are, they're also profound. Just that video is enough to have made it worth your drive tonight, obviously. But we have a lot to look forward to. Having said that, we have available for you 2 versions of the class tonight as we begin going through. And this is when I give respect to the authors for how well they did to give illustrations and explain what will help us in our own relationships, perhaps. So I've provided the chapter content for those in-house. And at this time, for the next few pages, we will go over a few, as on the screen, and discussion questions from that participant's guide we talked about, he mentioned, and other things up ahead in future classes will be made available to you. So I hope that you enjoy this style of teaching. It's great content, so I hope it blesses you. And follow along if you want to with the handouts available. Denise was in a funk, one that happened this time every year. Her and Rory's 23rd anniversary approached. Every year, her friends would mention it kindly, ask what their plans were, and congratulate them on their longevity as a couple. And she and Rory would do something special to commemorate their union. Having a sentimental and reflective nature, Denise would think about the years of marriage to Rory as the day drew near. And she would become sad as she thought about what had happened to their union over the years. It had become less of a union than a warehouse for lots of activities and interests. So many things had come into their lives, many of them good, such as children, careers, friends, church. But the couple's relationship revolved more around things and people than each other. Within her busy and fulfilling life, Denise often felt lonely and detached. It hadn't always been that way. During the first few years of their relationship, she and Rory had talked for hours. They had been deeply involved in each other's joys, hurts, and hearts. She thought she had found the soulmate she had prayed for all of her life, But as parenting and work and life had taken more of their time and energy, interpersonal involvement had waned. It wasn't what many couples report as a normal settling down of intensity as time goes on. No, it was more that she felt they were not close, except when other people and things were in the room. So for Denise, this anniversary was a sad memorial to a seemingly full life that contained a great deal of inexplicable emptiness. In other words, they just can't put their finger on why is there an emptiness or a void, a lack of fulfillment. So we see on the screen questions like, or statements like, God designed both spouses to invest continually in their achievement to each other. Couples need to work, therefore, to keep their love secure and safe. So on what points, if any, can you identify with Denise's feelings? Well, this is on now page 146 in the textbook. The outside affects the inside. The title, by the way, may have been a little deceiving. 3 is a crowd. That third entity may not even be a human being. It just may be something that's interfering. So with that being said, Denise's situation illustrates an important aspect of boundaries in marriage. The marriage itself, the union itself, needs to be actively protected. God designed both spouses to invest continually in their attachment to each other. And I'll insert a quote from John Gray, would say there's reason to not think that initial passion or attraction will always be there. So couples need to work to keep their love secure and safe as it matures. Many things compete for your love. And when you hear love and competition, think of perhaps even time, whatever takes your time. As we will see in this section, you cannot assume that the strong connection will always just be there, as they say it. Other forces can come between you and your mate and diminish the relationship. As Jesus taught in Mark chapter 10, and God himself has forged your marriage, therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. A bank guards its money. Each spouse must guard and protect the core of marriage, love. Love is at the core. Protect it. Invest in it. Marriage requires several kinds of boundaries to survive. We need to set limits on our individual needs, desires, and demands. Again, I will add, selfish people don't do this. They're not accountable. They just live for themselves as though they're single and have your mate come along. And in this case, that's not setting individual standards. Say, oh, I'll give you an example from a couple of weeks ago. Several Fridays, for obligation of either work or relationship, I don't stay at the skate park as long as I'd want to. That's a boundary set because of other priorities. It's just a small example. So we need to say no to sometimes our spouses or have that standard for reaction or behavior. And we also need to have boundaries between the marriage and the outside world to preserve what we have. The outside world deeply affects how the marriage operates. The pressures, the temptations, and even genuinely good opportunities come along from the outside world are limitless. There have been times that you can deny, in my world, you can deny, and several preachers that I invite for summer series say, I can't accept because I have made it a rule to not accept more than X amount for the sake of my wife or family. That's a boundary they've set. Excellent. So as we continue, as stewards of the marriage covenant, you need to know how to structure your relationship so that the outside doesn't control what's inside. All this sounds like a lot of work, and it is, but it becomes second nature with good habits, and it's well worth the effort. Here are some intruders that can weaken the marriage bond. What, if I were to open it up for class, you'd probably say everything on this list and more. I'd be curious to hear what you add to this list. Work, kids, outside hobbies and interests, even TV, in-laws. Church is great, but it's in this list. Internet, financial involvement, friends, addictions, or affairs. Now we have a slide question or two. Review that list. Which ones threaten your marriage bond, if they do? or have you struggled with in the past from experience? Most of these items aren't bad in and of themselves, Yet, when they come in between a couple's love, they can be destructive. You will need to work to protect your marriage. So before we talk in detail about these intruders, we need to discuss what drives the problem of intruders in the first place. So obviously the next class we have will deal with the specifics of these intruders. Knowledge will be helpful, and then we can be more aware of how to curb some of their potential impact and protect the union. But we have a marriage is only as strong as what it costs to protect it, they say. In other words, you value what you invest in. And that's a spin-off version to what they said prior in the video. You will have what you value because then you invest in it. If you have spent time and effort and sacrifice in preserving the marriage from other influences, your odds of a solid marriage are better. If life has just happened to your marriage, you will have a more fragile bond, like the man who sold all he had for the pearl of great price. Matthew 13, those who value the costs and preciousness of their marriage will pay a high price to preserve it. And when the sacrifice and investment is mutually seen, it's that much stronger. In explanation of the title, this is the portion that does best to talk about what's called triangulation. Why there should be 2 and not 3. This doesn't eliminate the influence of friends, obviously. But in the marriage, between 2, a precious covenant is there. Marriage is an exclusive club. Marriage is a 2-person agreement covenant, leaving all other parties out. That is to say, one husband, one wife. This is why wedding vows often include the phrase, forsaking all others. Marriage is meant to be a safe place for one's soul, so third parties can become disruptive to this safety. Triangulation is defined and described. Our love often gets segmented into other places. This problem, called triangulation, is one of the great enemies of good marriages. It occurs when one spouse brings a third party for an unhealthy reason. And think about that list we mentioned earlier. That triangle is created when, for example, let me say, a wife, person A, goes to a friend, person C, for something that she should share with her husband, person B. Now, I'm going to pause and say this does not take away the validity to the intervention portion of some of the cautions in previous chapters. Generic speaking now. Or in a family setting, a sibling perhaps, person A, calls you, person C, to talk about mom's problem without first talking to mom, person B. Here are some examples of this occurring in marriage. A wife talks to her best friend about her unhappiness with her husband, but doesn't let him know how she feels. A husband confides to his secretary that his wife doesn't understand him. One spouse makes their child a confidant, becoming closer to the child than her mate. And we're talking spiritual intimacy here. A husband is more invested in his parents than even in his wife. So many things can happen along this way. In all these examples, a spouse is taking a part of his heart away from his mate. It's not that it wasn't offered, that's another issue. It's that it's withheld, key point. And bringing it to an outside source. This is not only painful, but also unjust. It works against what God intended to develop in marriage, the mysterious unity that brings a couple closer to each other in ever-deepening ways. No, this triangulation, this interference betrays the trust and fractures the union. This is why God is so adamant about honest, direct relationships. He hates the deception and indirectness of the triangulation. And I think we discussed that in the last class. Gossip, for example, is a form of this. The person who gossips, person A, relates something to person B or to C behind B's back. And a gossip separates close friends, according to Proverbs 16. That happens. God tells us to speak the truth in love. If you happen to be person C, and this is happening to you, you're witnessing, hearing this, the one in the middle of two spouses, you may think you are helping the couple. And sometimes this happens, of course, with good intent. But in truth, we all need people to confide in us, yes. But if you are involved in two people moving farther apart, you are being destructive in spite of your, quote, good intentions. You may need to tell the person coming to you, he gives an example, Kathleen, these are hurtful problems between you and Dan. I feel for your struggle and I want to support you. And this is where I often say, sometimes couples or individuals need good, external, professional, trained counsel or guidance. And that's perfectly within reason. But until you are going to him first with these issues, I feel I'm a party to gossip and deception. So will you talk to him, or in this case maybe her, about it, and then let me know how I can help? Remember that he who conceals his hatred has lying lips, and whoever spreads slander is a fool. From Proverbs 10:18, I'll add an extra thought here about the first part. There's a time to be silent. There's times to say the right thing in the right way at the right time, and sometimes it's not now. But the idea is true that the relationship is not genuine if there is a holding back of what is held within. So this is where God encourages the reconciliation as a result of the conversation, or maybe even would say confession. So don't be either the person in the middle or the one going outside your marriage in unsafe ways. Married love requires a great deal of safety for intimacy to grow. It's where, your spouse knows your weaknesses, your vulnerabilities, and they know you know them. So it might as well be best to own them up to them as well. Marriage brings out the most vulnerable, fragile parts of who we are. And in page 149, it begins by saying, and these vulnerable parts need a warm, grace-filled, and secure environment in which to grow. If a third party threatens this, those fragile parts cannot be safe enough to emerge, connect, and develop. A wife who has trouble learning to trust others, for example, will have great difficulty investing in her husband if he is kinder to other people than to her, or if he discusses with friends what she shares in private with him. We can see some questions along this line. Look again at the examples. Which of these situations remind you of your marriage? Why is that interference from a third source painful, unjust, and even destructive? The effort to keep a caring connection for a lifetime would be impossible with the complexities of three. The only one who can do it perfectly is the Trinity. And of course, in that sense, we're unified by God. God is the one supporting the marriage as a husband and a wife, and he makes the three, and that's the emphasis on that. We have a few minutes before the bell, and I'm looking at the progress of good time. I would like to read a little bit more on this paragraph that says, in addition, marriage is designed to mature us. Living in such close proximity for so long with another person, who, by the way, is different, helps us come out of our isolation and self-centeredness. But it takes and again, I want to pause here because we had a whole lesson on living the singles life, and you can give your all to the Lord and invest in other people and grow, but there is a unique set of blessings, of course, for marriage that is to be known in that covenant. So having said that, it takes a great deal of work to grow in this context. You can be real with your colleagues and friends, but if you want to get the scoop on what someone is really like, the person to ask is your spouse. The very exclusivity of marriage is like an oven. There's a lot of heat, and you can't always escape when you'd like to. But this heat can help us grow also. The heat or the pressure of living so closely with someone else can help us face our weaknesses and work on them. I'll add that it's most important to always let what your spouse reveals force you to develop yourself. Of course, we want that in our spouse, and if there's boundary-loving spouses, it helps to know that both are growing in their own way. But always, in this way, focus on yourself as a priority, as a standard. Think about the enormous amount of work it takes to keep a caring connection for a lifetime. This effort would be impossible with the complexities of more than two. So only one can do this is the Trinity, quoted again on the screen. I'm looking at my watch and I realize we do have time for this section, which will complete our class tonight, and then I'll jump to a prayer. Forsaking is protecting. There are some things we have to give up, sacrifices we have to make. And I think the illustrations do well, so let's get going with this. This is in the middle, bottom of page 149. Most of us would like to avoid having to say no in life. It's work, it causes anxiety, and it can upset people. Yet reality dictates that in order to say yes to keeping a close marriage, you will have to say no to lots of other things. A life of yes to everything else ultimately results in a no to the marriage. You simply do not have the time, resources, or energy to do everything you want to do. Marriage involves much more than two loving people keeping love alive. It means doing some hard work, forsaking or leaving behind other things. That's not easy. Many newlyweds are often disheartened to find that they are constantly having to say no to many things to maintain their marriage. 150, page 150. When she was single, Linda loved being active in lots of things. She had a career, friends, trips, dinners, sports, and classes. She could juggle them all. When she and Tony fell in love and married, she attempted to keep them all going and take Tony along with her. Although he had been less active when single, he gamely went along. Finally, he said, "I don't like doing everything you do, but I don't like being home without you all the time either." So there was imbalances either way, obviously. Tony's dilemma began the boundary setting process. This is conflict. We've got to work on this. Linda had a hard time putting the brakes on some activities. She felt restricted by the marriage. She even resented Tony for feeling this way. But when she noticed that they were really missing each other and their closeness was being affected, she began feeling better about the compromises she was making. Yet, as she put it, "I thought marriage would be like singleness, only you take your husband along." She hadn't factored in the time it takes simply to maintain a connection. She was learning that marriage does involve forsaking some freedom to gain growth. Fortunately, Linda had the character to value Tony and forsake things that weren't as important. Couples need to normalize this discipline of forsaking and making it a part of everyday life. "I need to check it out with my spouse," quote unquote. "No, we need to spend some time together instead of this." Or are two of the best things, the quotes I just gave you are two of the best things any marriage person can say to protect his or her union from all intruders. All intruder problems are ultimately caused by, all right, here's the golden nugget of the latter portion of this class, caused by either adding the wrong thing, inappropriate people or bad influences, to the marriage, subtracting the good, closeness and honesty, from the marriage, or both. So there's either something that shouldn't be there, or there's something that should be and is not. And I'll give you a few moments of fellowship afterwards, because it's a good time, and I think that is the time. This section coming up is where we will begin next time, but I want to take you to the ending prayer that is at the end of this whole portion. And it's a good petition to remember as you think about all your relationships, yes, in principle, but primarily with the spouse. Something like this in prayer could be uttered. "I realize, Lord, how much I need your help. This is a lot of work. And I'm just human, so forgive me for neglecting my love obligation, for letting things interfere with my commitment to my spouse and draining me of time and energy." I'm just going to pause right there and say, ministers of all people, you would think they have it all together, but we've been married 14 years almost, and there are ebbs and flows of periods of time every 2 to 4 years where ministry gets in the way of my ministry. In this context, I think you understand, and it can easily do that if I'm not careful. Prior to marriage, I gave ministry my full focus, and that was very hard to realize. I can't do that anymore, not to do it right. So help me to make our differences a source of joy and conflict and ally. You know, I guess when it comes to structure, I've had more structure here at Oak Hill than I ever have in my life. And that's good, but it comes with lots of other prices. Protect us from intruders like busyness, work, even friends and time, and kids, good things perhaps, so that our marriage may be more what you intend it to be. Wow, so a lot of serious thoughts. And class time went by much quicker than I thought it would. It always does. So next week, we will finish chapter 12, this huge, monstrous chapter. And in summary, obviously, this class is about making sure nothing gets in the way of your covenant set priorities, and to the best of your ability, working on yourself as you improve the spouse as well. Bless